Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this month's installment of the MENASP Network webinar. So since COVID, we had this great idea of just doing these webinars online, and it's just a real honor to just pretty much on a monthly basis have colleagues joining us as speakers and as an audience, and I just really want to warmly welcome you all. I'm just especially happy with our speaker this afternoon. I don't think he needs an introduction. I know I've known him for a long time and referenced his work, so it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Stefan Hertog from the LSE. I will briefly introduce him, and he will be talking to us today about his research that's come out in a book that's recently been published. So very welcome, Stefan, and thank you very much for agreeing to tell us about your work today. Stefan is Associate Professor in Comparative Politics in the Department of Government at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He joined the government department in 2010 as a lecturer and was previously the Kuwait professor at Sciences Po in Paris, and lecturer in political economy at the University of Durham and postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton University. He holds sort of previous postgraduate qualifications from the University of Bonn, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and the University of Oxford. He's very well known for his work on the comparative political economy, comparative politics of the developing world, and particularly the Gulf and Middle East politics as well. And it's a real pleasure to have him on board with us, telling us a bit more about his work around development and welfare within Arab countries. So I shall hand over to him in a second. I believe he's got slides, and it'll be great to hear him and listen to him for about half an hour, and we will then open up for questions from everyone. So welcome again, Stefan, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Rana. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm quite excited because I've been doing too much work on the Gulf for too long a time, and I've gotten bored of it. So I've branched out into the wider Middle East, and I think that social policy and welfare regimes in particular are actually a very exciting topic. So I think I'm in exactly the right place to speak about the book, which is not sort of about social policy exclusively. It's about broader kind of structures of exclusion in Arab political economies, but social policies and welfare regimes are kind of one key pillar of my story. So I'll try to tell a somewhat broader story with my slides the next 25 minutes or so, and then if there are more kind of social policy specific questions, we can perhaps drill into that during the Q&A. And I should also mention that this book, or Cambridge Element as it's called, it's actually in terms of volume somewhere between a book and a paper. It's got like 40,000 words, 90 pages. It should be available for free download on the Cambridge University Press website. If that doesn't work, then just shoot me an email and I'll be happy to send you the PDF. I'll try to share some slides now, which are very, very voluminous. So I will not go through all of them. Again, I'm happy to share those. After the seminar, I just sort of skim through the most important ones. Oops, sorry, I just got to rearrange my screen a bit. I see my own slides. Yeah, that looks good. So insiders and outsiders in Arab political economies is what I'm going to try to talk about. And it's about insiders and outsiders on labor markets and insiders and outsiders among firms in the private sector. The whole thing is based on this new mini book, Locked Out of Development, that I just published a few months ago. And it's my first kind of systematic foray into Arab world outside of the Gulf. So I'm quite excited about doing this work, and I think of it as sort of an ongoing research program, and I want to do a lot more work in that direction. So I'm also looking forward to your feedback against that background. The descriptive claim that I'm going to make is that there's a deep division into insiders and outsiders in both labor markets and among firms in the Arab world, and it's kind of deeper, more rigid, more consequential than in other parts of the global South. And I'll also make sort of a causal argument about how this has been brought about historically, how it gets reproduced, how it's linked to a broader equilibrium of sort of insider politics, low productivity economics, and low skills. And yeah, if you're interested in the details, the book should be available for free. So I should explain which cases I'm talking about. I'm specifically talking about what I call core Arab states outside of the Gulf. So states that are not insanely oil rich, because the very oil rich cases have arguably a different political economy. So the core Arab states I'm interested in here are Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, and Yemen. So they have low to moderate levels of natural resource rents compared to the GCC or Libya. They were not recently involved in major long-term conflicts. Of course, Syria has been since 2011, but I'm here talking about the Syria up until 2010, which I think fits broadly the same mold as the other cases. And what's sort of historically significant about these cases is that I believe they've been part of a shared ideological space that has influenced development thinking and economic ideology across the region since the 1950s. So I think there's been a lot of copying and contagion going on between those regimes, although slightly less so in the case of Morocco, which explains why a lot of them look relatively similar in terms of labor market structures and private sector structures in sort of a global comparison. Of course, there's a lot of nuance, a lot of within region differences, but if you compare them to, say, cases in South Asia or Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, that set of cases actually has quite a few, at least descriptive commonalities. Okay, so here is a pretty ugly and involved graph that tries to summarize essentially the argument of the whole book. And I should mention that there's a long tradition of these involved and ugly graphs in a literature that's called Varieties of Capitalism. So that's a type of theorizing that really comes from the OECD world, from comparative political economy literature on Europe and the Anglosphere in particular. And so the underlying assumption of Varieties of Capitalism theories is that you can look at national capitalist systems as a whole. You can look at the different components, the labor market, the skill system, the financial system, and then look at how they interlink, how those different parts reinforce each other, and how they explain why different types of capitalism actually look quite different from each other in sort of a path-dependent and quite stable way. So it was sort of a reaction against the universal assumption that all capitalist systems would converge on one kind of market-driven Anglo-American liberal model, which clearly hasn't happened. And there's a pretty sophisticated literature on that regarding European economies in particular. It's increasingly been used sort of as a broad theoretical inspiration also for work on the global South. But most of that literature really is still quite Eurocentric, so I'm trying to bring some of those ideas to the Arab world with quite a few extensive tweaks. So the big kind of four descriptive pillars of my story are those four boxes here. So an interventionist, distributive state, so a state that's quite deeply involved in the economy and that distributes and redistributes resources quite deeply. Of course, not as much as Arab states did in the 60s and 70s, but still more than most other states do in the global South in comparison. Then a segmented labor market, so that's a labor market that's divided into insiders and outsiders. And the insiders, in my account, are mostly public sector employees, so people with secure, formal, long-term contracts in the public sector that are tied to formal social security and that give them sort of a basis of material security that other labor market participants in the private sector, by and large, don't have, because most of those private sector workers are in the informal market, so they're precarious. They don't have formal social security, contributory social security. They typically have lower wages, and they're much more exposed sort of to the naked forces of the market. And there's sort of a feedback loop between the state and the segmentation of the labor market, in the sense that the state provides those insider privileges. The insiders are a critical political constituency, even if they're shrinking numerically, and even if their privileges are not what they used to be, perhaps in the 70s and 80s. And as a result, both insiders, when they get politically organized, they defend their privileges or even ask for more privileges. And outsiders, when they want to improve their labor market status and mobilize politically about it, they actually tend to demand insider privileges themselves. So they're asked to be made insiders. And as a result, no matter which kind of demand is made and from which side, it tends to reinforce the system, because sort of insider status is the main currency of negotiation in that sort of process. And states, as authoritarian as they might be, they're often quite wary of touching insider privileges. So there's been a lot of erosion of those, but they're still, in global comparison, quite pronounced compared to, say, sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. Okay, so that's the labor market story. Then on the right side, we have a segmented private sector, that's divided into insiders and outsiders, where insiders are a much smaller constituency than the insiders on the labor market. There are essentially hundreds or at best thousands of firms in every market who are politically connected, who are crony capitalists and who enjoy a lot of informal protection from government. So there's a growing and very high quality literature on the econometrics of crony capitalism in the Middle East and Arab countries in particular that has quantified the extent of crony capitalism and its effects on development and job creation, which are very, very negative and quite substantial. And the outsiders in the private sector are essentially smaller, often typically informal firms that don't have that degree of access to the state, that if anything have a very antagonistic relationship with the state. They're afraid of the state as a regulator, of security forces cracking down on them, and because of their peripheral social and political status, again, they have very little input into economic policy making, whereas the insider firms are much better organized, they have much better access to the state, and as a result, those insider privileges tend to reproduce themselves. So even in a few cases where we had temporary democratic transitions, or at least democratic openings in the 2010s, insiders, cronies in the private sector have managed to defend their privileges quite effectively, with just a few very high-profile exceptions. And so the segmentation of the labor market into insiders and outsiders, which is very rigid, where it's very hard to become an insider when you're an outsider, and the same type of rigid segmentation in the private sector, together, I argue, undermine skill formation in the private sector. So that's the last block at the bottom of this graph, because a very rigid labor market where you're excluded from insider status, so from the few good jobs that pay a sort of middle class or low middle class wage, it gives you very little incentive to invest in your skills, because it's such an unmeritocratic labor market. You're either an insider or an outsider. You don't have a lot of influence over it, or if you have influence, then it's often through informal channels. It's through various forms of nepotism. So the incentives to improve your skills are quite weak. And in return, given that skill levels are quite low in the private sector, in the few instances where there is an opportunity for labor mobility, for getting a better job, people often can't use it because they don't have the skills level required to take those opportunities to start with. And you have a very similar kind of feedback loop between low skill levels and private sector segmentation. So the segmented private sector has insider firms that are very well protected and that don't really need to be particularly productive or innovative or at the cutting edge of technology or skills formation. As a result, because they're sitting pretty, they don't really invest in skills. They don't do a lot of in-house training. So that also contributes to low skill levels. They also don't ask systematically for a lot of quality training from governments, despite all kind of performative complaints about skills and bad education systems. And in return, because of the prevailing low skill levels, and that's that arrow that goes to the right, the few firms who want to become more productive, who want to invest in, who want to use skills and acquire technology in the process, they can't do it because the local talent pool, the local skills pool is so weak. Of course, there are millions of outsider firms that are not protected, that don't enjoy privileges, but those are so marginal, they're so weak, so undercapitalized that even if they wanted to invest in skills, they wouldn't have the resources to do so. So in these ways, both insider-outsider divisions in the labor market and in the private sector undermine skill levels and productivity in those in those economies. And then there's this one final arrow through the middle, so the bendy one that goes from the segmented private sector to the segmented labor market. And that is also politically quite important. And what I show here, and there's quite extensive data on that, is that the segmented private sector, as weak and undeveloped as it is, provides very few good formal jobs. So that there's good econometric evidence that insider firms produce fewer jobs than would be produced on a more competitive market. And of course, outsiders, to the extent those firms are informal, they don't produce they don't provide good formal jobs either. As a result, most formal jobs with open-ended or at least formal contracts and social security in the Arab world are actually in the public sector, which is quite unusual in international comparison. As a result, there's kind of weak political linkage between the private sector and labor market participants, because the private sector really doesn't do a lot for labor market participants. It doesn't create a lot of good jobs for them. And you might wonder where social safety and welfare fit in. That is mostly an aspect of the segmented labor market system, where so much of welfare is organized along the kind of old school Bismarckian model, where people get benefits that are tied to formal employment. So formal contributory benefits, pensions, health insurance, that you only get if you've got a formal work contract, and most of those formal work contracts are in the private sector, in the public sector, and outsiders in the private sector get very, very weak welfare provision, because non-contributory welfare systems, social assistance systems are quite underdeveloped in the Arab world. So there's a particularly steep gradient between the welfare provisions for insiders and the welfare provisions for outsiders, which make becoming an insider or keeping one's insider status on the labor market such a high stakes issue. So that's essentially the story of the book. And I'll now just very, very quickly skim through some of the subsequent slides to give you a bit of a descriptive flavor of some of the facts and some of the data that I've been using to try to corroborate this overall story. And I should say, perhaps before I go into that very quickly, that this whole argument is a bit of a counter-narrative, in my view, to the prevalent, at least academic narrative, that everything that's wrong and bad and unequal and non-developmental in the region is due to neoliberal reforms. I agree that economic reforms have been quite badly managed, have been quite lopsided. A lot of neoliberalism has taken away social benefits and has taken away subsidy regimes that in some cases benefited outsiders. But the fundamental story in the region to me is not that everything has been marketized and everyone has been sort of exposed to the brutal forces of free competition. Instead, the key story for me is that some, namely the outsiders on the labor market and outsiders among firms, are indeed exposed to a brutal, informal labor market with no clear protection, no significant welfare provision. But at the same time, there's also a protected minority that's very much shielded from the market, both on the labor market side and on the firm side, where you've got actually a very deep state presence protecting those actors. So the story is not one of too much state or too little state or too much liberalization or too little liberalization. It's the very uneven nature, in my view, of the presence of the state that excessively protects some and does nothing for others. So it's a very uneven nature of reforms and of the presence of the state that I think is both descriptively what makes the region stand out and sort of causally contributes to a lot of the inequality, a lot of the social exclusion, and a lot of the lack of economic dynamism across the region. That's sort of my big theoretical point. Now, you might say that a lot of what I've said is sort of typical of many developing countries, and some of it indeed is. So many developing countries have low government capacity and can't provide services or protection for everyone. There's also segmentation of business and labor into formal and informal markets all across the global south. But there are a couple of important factors within that I think are regionally specific to the Arab world. So the relative importance and the historical ambition of the state and the economy, I think, are what make the region still stand out despite all downsizing and partial reforms and fiscal retrenchment. And I've got some data on that. And then the relative size of the insider coalition on the labor market. So the size of government employment and the size of some subsidy schemes that still predominantly benefit insiders are really, well, not unique, but certainly more pronounced in the region than in other regions. And then critically, the very rigidity of insider-outsider divisions that are cemented by particularly pronounced weakness of universal social security and safety mechanisms that would benefit outsiders is also something that makes the region stand out. The very low mobility between insider and outsider status. So the fact that it's very hard to graduate from being an informal firm to becoming a mid-sized, productive, formal firm. The very low mobility of outsiders on the labor market, so people who are unemployed or informally employed, to insider status, that's also something makes the region stand out. There's much more mobility, there's much more fluidity between insider and outsider status in Latin America, for example. And then finally, just descriptively, there are uniquely low levels of trust and cooperation between state, business, and labor, which I think has made it so hard to negotiate a new, more inclusive social contract, and which I think has a lot to do with the fact that insiders and outsiders have very different interests, distrust each other, and in particular, insiders in business are very, very much distrusted in the wider population, and it's as a result very hard to make them part of sort of a new reform bargain. Okay, I'll just jump over a lot of that stuff, the deep state presence, and I'll go straight to this graph, which gets at, I think, some of the historical root of what we're seeing in the region, and that is polling data from the World Value Survey that shows that, with the exception of Morocco, citizens in the Arab world are kind of uniquely strong in their expectation that government should make sure that everyone is provided for. So there's a pretty high, and I think deeply historically rooted, expectation that government should care for people. And of course, Arab governments have failed to live up to that kind of expectation for decades. But I think it explains why some of those insider privileges and government employment in particular are so sticky. So they're very high expectations. The government is expected to do a lot, but doesn't really have the capacity to do it, or has only the capacity to do it by nowadays a minority of people. Here you see that the share of government spending in GDP, although it's gone down in all those cases significantly since sort of the 70s oil boom era, it's been retrenched, particularly in the 80s during the period of partial structural adjustment. It still remains higher than in other low to mid-income countries around the world. So you still have larger state apparatuses than in most other places. And one key facet of this deep presence of the state in the economy is the high levels of state employment, which we see in this graph. And not only is there more state employment than in most other countries, again, with the exception of Morocco, but it's also particularly privileged state employment. Now that, might sound a bit odd if you know how bad the living standard of people on, say, a civil service wage in Tunisia or Egypt is these days. But it remains true that relative to workers in the private sector, even people on formal contracts, on average, hourly wages are higher in the public sector, social benefits are much more generous, retirement options are more generous, social security provisions more generous, and of course, job security is much, much higher. So this is still sort of, for most Arabs, according to poll data, so the gold standard of the kind of job they want to have, even if in absolute terms, or sort of longitudinally over time, the quality of public sector employment has declined significantly in some cases. But much higher than other world regions, public employment, and it's a critical part of the old fraying, but still politically consequential social contract. And here you see that the majority of formal employment, so the majority of employment where you have a formal job that is based on a contract and can lead to formal social security contributions, happens in the public sector. So the private sector in all countries produces fewer formal, in other words, kind of good quality jobs than the public sector. And that's very unusual in international comparisons. So in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of formal employments, the majority of good jobs are actually created in the private sector. So that reflects both the size of the public sector in the Arab world, but also the weakness of the private sector, which I argue is related to segmentation, the fact that insiders don't create a lot of jobs, they don't have to be very dynamic, and outsiders, informal small firms can't, they don't have the resources to create good formal jobs. At the same time, the majority of workers in the whole economy nowadays are in the informal economy in all of those places. So they're all in the private sector. That's not unusual in international comparison compared to other low to mid-income countries. What is unusual is what I showed to you before, that among the minority of formal jobs, the majority are actually in government. Here's some margins plots from some wage regressions that I did with the most recent labor force survey data available for 4 Arab cases. And what it shows essentially is that hourly wages are still by some margin the best for government jobs, even better than formal private sector jobs. And there's a lot of sort of anecdotal stories that nowadays, if you want to make a good career, you got to be in the private sector. That's true for a small elite, but sort of for the modal, for the typical, for the average private sector participant, the deal in the public sector still is better than in the private sector. Then loads of evidence that mobility between segments is particularly low in the region. So informality is stickier. You stay in the informal employment or long-term unemployment for longer. Breaking into the formal labor market is harder. Conversely, if you're an insider, particularly if you have a government job, you're very, very secure. There's almost never a redundancy in the public sector, whereas there's a lot more turnover and redundancy in the public sector in Latin America, for example. So as a result, the stakes are particularly high. Once you become an insider, it's sort of a benefit for a lifetime. If you're an outsider at any one point, you're likely to stay an outsider for a very, very long time. Also evidence here with a share of long-term unemployed among all unemployed. It's higher typically in the region, which means that long-term unemployment is one aspect of being an outsider. The other one being sort of precariously or informally employed, and again, this is longer. Is more prevalent than in other regions where you switch more quickly between unemployment and other labor market statuses. And then here's the bit, and I'll probably wrap up briefly after that, that's most relevant to the social security and social policy dimension. The whole social security system in the region tends to be organized around the needs of insiders. So social benefits tend to be organized around formal employment. So they're contributory pensions, contributory health insurance, contributory unemployment insurance, and those are only available to people with formal jobs. And again, most of those are in the public sector. And as a result, the actually, in some cases, quite generous systems, pensions in particular, only go to people who are on the inside and already have more secure jobs and higher wages. So these are just, unfortunately, it's quite old data, but I don't think it's changed fundamentally. These are gross replacement rates from pension systems in MENA and a couple of other world regions that essentially show you that average pensions relative to previous earnings in the job are higher in MENA than elsewhere. At the same time, spending on other types of social safety, so social safety mechanisms that would benefit outsiders, conditional cash grants, unconditional cash grants, state pensions, these types of mechanisms, minimum income guarantees, wage subsidies for informally, precariously employed, those are uniquely weak in the Middle East and North Africa and in our core Arab countries in particular. So they all spend less on this than other developing countries in Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. So there's a lot of subsidy spending still, although that's been downsized in many cases. But subsidy spending actually tends to be regressive because insiders tend to have higher incomes and larger and richer households tend to consume more subsidized goods. So there's very little provision that specifically targets or benefits outsiders. And I think this has to do with the fact that insider benefits are so costly and really crowd out spending on social safety for outsiders, specifically for the informally employed. A couple of political feedback loops that I think reproduce the system. I'm not going to go into detail other than to say that insiders are historically more recognized as the core political social constituency of authoritarian regimes. And to the extent that they're organized or that there is labor organization, it tends to be organized around insider interests, most notably through the UGTT in Tunisia, which is very much an insider cartel, which very much represents the needs and the demands of sort of middle-aged, usually male public sector employees in Tunisia, and has actually a very tense relationship with the smaller and weaker organizations representing unemployed or precariously employed. So that's sort of part of this political feedback loop. And on the insider-outsider dynamics in the private sector, I won't say much because there's already great literature on crony capitalism. I just say that so the fundamental dynamics, even if the details are very different, are equivalent to, I think, what's happening in the labor market. So there are insider firms that get unusually high levels of protection, both formal and informal, through government, and they're much better organized, much better representing their interests than outsider firms. Yeah, here's some quite striking pieces of statistics on the extent of cronyism and the impact it has on the economy. So in Egypt in 2010, according to an estimate, I think by Ishaq Diwan and other economists, 92% of loans extended to the private sector went to firms with political links. So firms where people close to Mubarak or the NDP, the ruling party at the time, either had ownership or had a board seat. Almost all of the money, both from state banks and also from private sector banks that were under kind of state influence, almost all of the credit went to insider firms. So outsider firms find it very, very hard to get credit and grow. In Egypt, politically connected companies under Mubarak accounted for only 11% of total employment, but 60% of total net profits among listed firms. So huge monopoly rents, a huge profit deriving from the fact that the state protects you, but not a lot of employment generation. So not a lot of formal good jobs that the wider population would benefit from. And it hasn't really changed fundamentally with the Arab Spring, unfortunately, in either Tunisia or Egypt. Very low dynamism in terms of new firm entries, so very few limited liability companies being created across all these cases where we have data, and limited liability companies are sort of the main vehicle worldwide for setting up a mid-sized formal business. Very low mobility between segments. Insider firms tend to be older. They don't exit a lot. Outsider firms, informal firms become formal and grow more rarely than in other world regions. Well, I think I'll jump over that and just point you to that. Again, interesting graph from the World Value Survey, which shows you that in the Arab world, there's a particularly deep distrust among the wider population of large companies. So this is the percentage of people in the World Value Survey, sixth wave, I think, that said that they have no trust at all, no confidence at all in large companies. And I think this reflects sort of the distrust of insiders and crony capitalists. And that explains some of the difficulty of finding sort of a new social contract that would have to involve the private sector. I think, I'll skip over the whole skills segment because I'm out of time, but I'm happy to go back to that and how I think it links to inside and outsider structures in the private sector. I also have a story about the historical origins. I think a lot of this has to do with the types of states and development programs that were created during the heyday of Arab nationalism in the 50s and 60s, and the way those models diffused across the region, the way that states overpromised at the time, but then couldn't deliver fiscally, and then at the end of the day had to reduce the benefits they could provide to ever shrinking insider constituencies. But we can have a look at this in the Q&A. Final point. The whole sort of ideal type that I've laid out is best represented, I think, among the Arab republics with a particularly deep legacy of state intervention and sort of nationalist development. So it would be sort of Algeria, Egypt, and Syria. Jordan, Morocco are still closer to the ideal type than other developing countries, but they don't fit it quite as nicely. And that kind of links actually back to the historical origins story rooted in Arab nationalism, which was particularly pronounced in the republics. So I think I'll stop sharing, and I'm almost on time, so I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Stefan. No, I'm actually really intrigued by your very last slide. And if people don't mind, I wouldn't mind hearing something about Algeria for one more minute, because yes, it's hopefully a case study that we're working on. We could probably learn from you. Yes. Feel free to say something.
Quickly,
and then we'll finish
at the very end to see how many spare slides I have for you.
Algeria,
yeah, that is this one, right?
Yes.
So I got to shift you around on my screen so I can reach the button. There we go. So what I have at the end of the book is these nice spider graphs that map every country on the key indicators that I use to show sort of what these countries look like. And I've arranged the indicators in a way that if you're closer to my ideal type, so if you have all the characteristics that I talk about, then your dots are closer to the center. And Algeria is the best theoretical case. It's the worst case in terms of how it scores on all those indicators. So it's doing much worse than both the rest of the world in general and low to mid income countries specifically. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that it went through this very deep phase of statist economic development. It had a particularly weak private sector because capital was essentially French owned, and they all left or they were all thrown out. It also had sort of middling levels of rents that allowed it to sort of run with that model for longer even than Egypt or Syria could have. But it, again, didn't have as much rents as the Gulf, where those insider-outsider systems are much less pronounced because there's enough resources essentially to make all citizens insiders. So Algeria is in this uncomfortable space where it could run very far with that model, but not far enough to provide for everyone.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Stefan. And clearly, we'd love to have more time, but hopefully this is a conversation to continue. I hope the book or the research paper is available electronically, so we try and access it. But yeah, certainly this is an email to the library here as well. Right, I'm sure there'll be comments and questions from colleagues as well joining online. So if we can, thanks Stefan for your presentation, very interesting, and just give the floor to colleagues for your questions or comments, please, either in the chat or online, maybe taking a minute to digest rather in the chat or in person. So you can put your hand up or post a question in the chat. Okay, well, while people, oh, please, yeah, Manis has posted a little instruction. Right, well, I'm going to come in, yeah, because I've got a few questions and comments. I'll probably won't say them all because just to give Stefan a chance to respond, but I'm sure colleagues will also have additional thoughts. So just right on the data, if I may, Stefan, in terms of the insider-outsider categorization, could you say a bit more about the source of the data for this categorization?
Yeah, so it depends on whether we're talking about the labor market or firms. For the labor market, I just use, I mean, I know that sort of informality is a contested concept, and you can measure it in many different ways. But I used sort of, when I did work with micro survey data from labor force surveys, I used existing codings of formal and informal where it existed in the data set, or where it didn't exist, I just used subscribed to Social Security or is not subscribed to Social Security as a proxy. Obviously, that is imprecise, and there are many other ways of measuring it, and there are also degrees of many shades of gray. Like you can have a government job on a temporary contract, which I think still kind of makes you an outsider, even if you're in government. Or you can have a formal job, but with reduced benefits. But I think sort of as a first cut, the distinction of public sector employees with a formal long-term contract and private sector employees without a formal contract, that would be sort of the best first cut to get at the heart of it. And for the cronies, it's obviously harder, right? It's people can be insiders and it might not be visible. It's not necessarily the case that you have someone on your board or you have a known owner who is politically connected. So if anything, I think all that literature that I rely on, it undercounts the insiders, because there'll be some forms of insider connections that are not visible through those proxies that they use. But I think you can be pretty sure that whom they count as insider is actually an insider. You know, if you got someone from the NDP in Egypt on your board under Mubarak, then it's very likely you're politically connected. And again, there are shades of gray regarding informality for firms. You know, they might be formal in some respects, but informal in others. So I think that there's just a big stylized facts about insiders and outsiders. If you can cut it more finely, and there are a lot of shades of gray.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot more from the book as well. So thank you. Graham, would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
Yes, please. So I was very interested in your talk. You were focusing, I hope it's fair to say, on endogenous factors within these different countries producing rather similar political economies. What the question I want to ask is, how significant is the international political economy, which this group of countries sits within, and particularly sitting as they do downstream of the European economy. So how far are they affected by the functioning of the European labour market, the role of European corporations, and the public policies of European governments? So, that sort of dependency relationship.
That's a great question. And yeah, my book's very sort of methodologically nationalist, like a lot of VOC, varietal capitalism literature is. And I think that there's some justification for that, because the levels of integration into the international economy are relatively lower for most of those cases compared to, say, Eastern European or Latin American countries, where multinational corporations play a much larger role, FDI plays a much larger role, international trade integration, international value chains plays a much larger role. All of that said, I think there are international links that have actually helped to reproduce that system and keep it alive for longer than it would have existed otherwise. Because what I describe really is a kind of zombie Nasserism, right? It's just a deeply decayed version of the types of political economies that were created through ambitious state-driven development drives in the 1960s. And you had similar drives in other parts of the global south, although usually not quite as ambitious in the Arab world. And change in other parts has been more profound. Like structural adjustment in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa has been much more brutal in many cases, right? So the IMF imposed types of conditionality and austerity that were much more brutal in some East African cases than anything that's ever happened in the Arab world. And I think in some cases, halving the public sector workforce of some African countries within just a few years, which is nothing that we've ever seen in any similar shape or form in the Arab world. So I think there's some international forces that have actually helped to reproduce that, the kind of status quo. One is rent flows. So flows of aid and other forms of capital injection from the Gulf that maintain those systems on a level that fiscally they couldn't have been maintained otherwise. Strategic rents from the United States for cases like Jordan or Egypt. The influence of the United States over, say, the IMF, which has really, compared to other world regions, soft pedaled quite a bit in the region. So we all complain about IMF conditionality and what it's done in the region in the 80s and 90s, but it's actually been relatively soft compared to what's happened in other world regions. Also, remittance flows. It's another thing that's maintained household incomes and domestic demand because of worker remittances from the Gulf at a scale that wouldn't have been available in many other countries in the global south. And then I think one key link to Europe is actually migration. It's migration as sort of a social pressure valve that's again taken some pressure off some of those governments, including skilled migration. The people who demonstrated on Tahrir Square, those were often underemployed, or in Tunisia in particular, those were often underemployed graduates. And as long as you can send some of those people abroad to migrate, you take some pressure out of your system. I think the only country that's really deeply integrated into value chains and European capital is Morocco, with the automotive industry in particular, and to some extent textile industries. But Morocco is also the case that's sort of the most peripheral in my account, that fits sort of my model the least. So I think the other countries rather stand out for actually not being very integrated into European value chains, being relatively isolated in comparison to other countries in the global south.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, it was a little long. I'll try to be more concise.
What about Egypt? That's quite interesting, that point. What about Egypt in terms of its integration into the global economy?
I think relative to the size of its economy and population, the stock of FDI is not very high. There's little exports that it does, certainly not a lot of exports of companies, of enterprises owned by foreign entrepreneurs. To the extent that there is FDI, a lot of it goes into domestic service sectors, hotels, retail, and a lot of this is Gulf capital that I don't think has sort of changed the shape of that economy fundamentally.
Yeah. And actually, in many ways, Egypt and Jordan as well are particularly aid dependent, and there are sort of perspectives on that as well. I had a similar question to Graham, so thanks very much. I think the link to social protection, and because that's part in a way of your categorization of the insider outsider, is an interesting one, and I'm sure one that we will come back to. Would anybody else like to pose any more questions or comments?
Sorry. Thank you for your presentation. I am Yusuke Kawamura, assistant professor at Kobe University, and now I am a visiting research fellow at the University of Bath. My research question is really related to Rana's first question about distinguishing between insider and outsider. In your paper or in your presentation, you try to distinguish insider and outsider, and I think former workers in the public sector are included into the former category, insiders. But I think many formal workers in MENA countries my research interest is about Egypt. So many workers, public sector workers in Egypt, their living condition worse and worse. So I'm wondering if they are really insider in the labor market. I think many insider are really dividing into other two categories: real insider and weak or poor insiders. So
thank you. No, I think that's a good point. And on Egypt, I used the most recent labor force survey data that I could get, which was from 2019. So that was already after quite a bit of austerity, several devaluations of the currency, and certainly, as you outlined, a decline over time of the living standards of public sector employees. And yet they still have significantly higher earnings per hour than people in the private sector. So I think what's been happening in Egypt is that everyone's just got worse off. And the relative privilege of the insiders has actually, until recently at least, been quite stable. Now, with the most recent devaluation and sort of near social collapse of Egypt, that might change. You know, we don't have the data on that yet. After previous devaluations, there was always compensation measures. The government then always adjusted the nominal wages of public sector civil servants, and it reproduced their relative privilege quite systematically, even if in absolute terms they were worse off over time. Now, Egypt might have really reached the end of its runway, and perhaps now the insider privileges are so diluted that essentially almost everyone is an outsider. You know, that's one way out of the current system where you just pauperize everyone. But I think the data aren't in yet. What I would say though is that I mean, people often tell me, well, a lot of those insiders, the guys who sit for 6 hours in the Mugamma in Sibti, they then go out on the informal labor market and drive a taxi. So they're also part-time outsiders. And I think that's true, but there's still a big difference between having the basic security of a government job, on top of which you generate some extra earnings, and also the government pensions and everything else you get, relative to being a complete outsider, and having no benefits and no security. And certainly there are many gradations of insiders. Probably people in the security apparatus are paid much better. If you're a teacher in the public sector in a provincial town, it's really a pretty bad deal you get. But controlling for age and level of education and gender and region and everything that I could in my wage regressions, people in the public sector, at least in 2019, still were on average quite a bit better off.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Yusuke. Marlies, you got your hand up?
I do, and this is just wanting to follow up. You actually spoke to it very much. It is about like, how do you get out of the bind? And you seem to be relating, on the social policy front in particular is what I'm thinking about. And you're drawing where you're making the point that there's a lot of historical reasons behind how this developed. That you have a lot of, sort of the government or the benefits going to government insiders in particular. And so then those are the jobs that everybody wants to have. How is it that one breaks out of that? I'm sorry, at the end of your last answer, you were talking about like pauperization of everybody. That's one way forward. Or it's one way to change the system, but not entirely clear. I was curious, why didn't the Arab Spring wasn't this part of the impetus behind the Arab Spring to sort of dislodge, let's just call it the establishment? I think in Europe, we'd have more of a sense of like there's an establishment that we're wanting to bring down. Why if that was an effort, it didn't succeed as such, and how would you describe that lack of success? Let's say, not explain necessarily, but even just like how would you describe it within your model?
That's a great question. And I guess there was really only one case where there was a genuine chance for a new social contract on the basis of a political opening, which was Tunisia, because the opening in Egypt was just too short to really reform the system. And there are precedents from other regions where a political opening has led to some extent to a negotiation of a new social contract. So if you look at the rapid spread of modern social safety mechanisms that are not tied to formal employment, or the cash grant systems, conditional and unconditional in Latin America, a lot of this happened in the wake of democratization, from military rule to democratic political competition. And then new political entrepreneurs realized that those outsider constituencies are actually a numerical majority. So if you get them organized and you offer them a good shake, you can both potentially win an election and reform the welfare system, even if that is to the detriment to some extent of the insiders. And it's a big puzzle why no one kind of dared this sort of political mobilization in Tunisia, where there would have been an opening. And I think there are a couple of potential factors. One is that insiders were just politically, socially much better organized. And the UGTT really, I mean, as much as it has done for the democratic transition, and it's earned its Nobel Prize probably in that regard, socially, it's been a really regressive force, because it's been defending public sector hiring, public sector salaries, public sector pensions, and it's done nothing for the outsiders. So it's very much like sort of the labor aristocracy unions that you have in continental Europe, like in Germany, for example, where the IG Metall gets a great deal for sort of legacy formally employed workers in the industrial sector, but does nothing for precariously employed service workers, which are much, much worse represented. And the IG Metall even refused the introduction of a minimum wage in Germany for decades, because it wanted full autonomy over negotiating wages. Although it didn't represent the people who were, below minimum wage living standards. So the UGTT, as a very, very important, by far the most important union in the region, I think it's an important part of the story. And then probably the party system in Tunisia and the sort of social and ideological fault lines also didn't help, because it was all about secular versus Islamist and Nahda versus Nida Tunis and the Felul. So there was much more identity politics going on, and not enough space, I think, to systematically think about socioeconomic issues and socioeconomic identity. So it's a huge missed opportunity. And Tunisia, in many ways, during the democratic phase, made things worse, because it spent a lot more money on insiders, a lot of extra hiring in the public sector, hundreds of thousands of phantom jobs of people not even showing up for work. The largest share of public sector salary spending in GDP at some point, I think, of almost any country in the world, like 17% of GDP in 2021. There was some additional resources for outsiders. So there was some social safety net spending and some reform there through a couple of systems. But if you look at the total increase in public sector salary spending as a share of GDP, since the fall of Ben Ali until 2021, it's 5 times higher than the total volume of social safety net spending. So a huge wasted opportunity, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. Again, lots of thinking, and thanks, Marlies, for your question there. I mean, if we may, in kind of the last 2 minutes to wrap up, I think it'd be interesting to see how a lot of the economic turmoil that pretty much all of the Arab countries, maybe save the Arab Gulf, but the rest of low middle income countries are facing, and in a way that will probably devalue, as I think you've already alluded to, Stefan, this insider-outsider juxtaposition with inflation. Yep. Inflation in some countries, I mean, several countries are on the brink, I mean, of some kind of collapse, and you've already mentioned Tunisia there. So, so hence, what other channels there will be to be able to access job security? I mean, certainly, I know countries you haven't referred to because of the model you've taken, but somewhere like Lebanon, for example, where public sector workers' salaries are actually lower than the family allowance that's given to poor households through the National Poverty Targeting Program, because, of course, of the devaluation of the currency. I mean, I just want to, it is the hour that's up now, and I did want to touch on the social policy and social protection aspects of this. I think, I mean, it's an interesting changing scene, and historically, because of the subsidies, this region has actually been the highest spender on what we might class social assistance, because subsidies falls under that broad social assistance category. And I think we're very much now in the stage of the reform process and seeing how countries make use partly of the fallout of the COVID pandemic, but also how they restructure their budgets to try and meet the social needs and the economic needs that are compounding. So a scene to watch, and probably another conversation to have about Algeria with you, Stefan. But thanks very much. You're really, really interesting. And yes, I shall be signing up to your book very shortly. Any final words, Stefan, before we wrap up?
Perhaps on what you said about sort of social assistance reform. It's true that there's a lot happening, and that direction is positive, but it's just so late, and the resources have been so completely exhausted through maintaining this insider coalition that the only way of avoiding the complete pauperization way out, so the Egyptian path or the Lebanese path, is significant donor commitment. And I think what we need is a donor commitment that's tied together to a genuine political pact that cuts into some of the insider privileges and makes massively larger resources available to outsiders, and that's only possible with external money at this point.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So a scene to watch. We're certainly kept busy. Thank you, Stefan, again. I'll clap for you, and well done. And
thanks very much
to everyone for putting this on. All the best, and we hopefully will meet again soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye, everyone. See you all. Bye-bye.